Whenever I have to teach a poem of W.B.Yeats, I state that the greatness of Yeats as a poet is unquestionable, is beyond debate, and that we have very categorical reasons for saying that Yeats is a great poet. First of all, he was a prolific producer of verse. He managed to create a substantial body of poetry through a lifetime of dedication to the muse. His poetry is always good. In fact, he seems to be simply incapable of writing mediocre poetry. So great is his dedication to the muse, so meticulous his craftsmanship, that it is simply impossible to find even a page of mediocre poetry in the collected poems of W.B. Yeats. Yeats was a passionate poet, a poet who constantly experimented, a poet who constantly developed, a poet who constantly evolved. And as a result, there is very little in common between the earliest poems of Yeats and the last poems of Yeats. These are the things that I usually say when I have to teach a Yeats poem. But there are also a couple of things which I usually fail to say, and I shall say them now. The first of these is that Yeats is a fantastic nature poet. Yeats is to Ireland what Wordsworth is to England, or Wordsworth is to the Lake District. Yeats loved nature passionately as Wordsworth did. And I think Yeats had a spiritual affinity with nature. There cannot be a better proof of all this than the present poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. The second thing I would like to say is that Yeats is an excellent children's poet. This point is seldom made by teachers while teaching Yeats. There are quite a few poems in the collected poems of Yeats which especially appeal to children, to schoolboys, to schoolgirls, to young people. Examples of this are The Lake Isle of Innisfree, of course, The Stolen Child, The Ballad of Father Gilligan, He Who Wishes for the Clouds of Heaven. I am very happy to teach The Lake Isle of Innisfree today because it is one of the most famous poems of W.B. Yeats. Not merely one of the most famous poems of W.B. Yeats, one of the most famous poems in Irish literature. In fact, I think it can be safely called Ireland's most favorite poem. This poem is featured on the passports of Ireland, printed on the passports of Ireland. And I don't think there is an Irishman who does not know this poem. And it was one of my most treasured poems when I was a child. Let us take a close look at the title of the poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. Isle means island. Lake Isle. The poet is here referring to not an island in the sea, but an island in a lake, the Lake Isle. The lake here is what is locally known as Lough Gill. Lough Gill is a lake in County Sligo, and I think Lough is a word related to the Scottish word loch and the English word lake. Innisfree is an island in the middle of a lake. The lake is Lough Gill or Loch Gill in County Sligo, largely in County Sligo. And Innisfree is a small island which even today is uninhabited. So the poem is about Innisfree, a small uninhabited island in the middle of a lake, and the lake is Lough Gill, which lies largely in County Sligo. A word about the context in which the poem came to be written might be appropriate. The poem was written in 1888 and published in the National Observer in 1890. The poet was walking down Fleet Street and he heard the sound of water splashing in a fountain in a shop window. And he was reminded of his native Sligo, of the Sligo countryside with its water bodies and waterfalls. He felt overwhelmed by a sense of nostalgia. He was overcome by a sense of homesickness. And the poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, started forming itself in his head. Thus, what is arguably the most famous, the most popular, the most favorite poem in all Irish literature was written not in Ireland but in England, but in a foreign country. There is certainly a magic about the name Innisfree. For one thing, it is a typically Irish name, symbolizing everything that Ireland stands for in the mind, in the imagination, in the life of the poet. For another, the concluding sound in the name, free, free, signifies for the poet the intense longing for freedom that he felt while he was in London, while he was, as he saw it, shackled in London. Innisfree is to the poet everything that London is not. London is a great city, a great metropolis. Innisfree is a small island in the remote countryside of Ireland. London is densely crowded. Innisfree is absolutely uninhabited. London is far away from nature, being one of the great cities of the Western world. Innisfree is nature personified. London, with its hectic activity, with its feverish pace, with its mindless pursuits, denies to the poet the one thing that he deeply, passionately desires, and that is peace. And it is this peace which he hopes to find in Innisfree. I would like to draw your attention to the tremendous influence of the American philosopher, poet, essayist, transcendentalist, naturalist, Henry David Thoreau on this poem, especially of Thoreau's great book, Walden, on this poem. And you must remember that Walden carries the alternative title, Life in the Woods. Please note the very beautiful opening of the poem. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. The poet makes use of will, not shall, because it is an expression of a decision, because he wants it to convey the determination that he feels. I will arise and go now. He will get up. He has allowed things to drift for too long a time. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree. Innisfree, as I said, is an uninhabited island in the middle of a lake in a remote part of Ireland. And the word Innisfree, as I have already pointed out, captures by its sounds, by the shape of its sounds, the magic of the Irish countryside, the magic of Emerald Isle, and a small cabin built there. Undoubtedly, W.B.Yeats is inspired here by Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, who built a small cabin in the woods and whose experiments regarding living in the woods is recorded in his masterpiece, Walden, and a small cabin built there, of clay and wattles made. Wattle is building material, made of sticks, rods, and the clay is used to plaster the sticks and the rods. And traditionally in rural Ireland, huts used to be made of clay and wattle. Outside you could see only the wattle. Sorry, outside you could see only the clay. But below the clay surface, there was the wattle. A large number of sticks, rods of various sizes arranged in a particular manner. 9 bean rows will I have, a hive for the honey bee. Again, we can find the influence of Thoreau on the poem. Thoreau cultivated beans near his cabin, near his hut in the woods at Walden Pond. And the poet also wants to do the same thing. Beans symbolize an austere life, but they also symbolize a healthy life. Above all, they symbolize wisdom. 9 bean rows. Why 9? W.B.Yeats was no stranger to the Eastern religions, to the Eastern mythologies. And 9 has a special place in Hindu numerology. In fact, I would say that it is the most sacred number from the perspective of Hindu numerology. 9 symbolizes divinity, completion, success, fortune, joy, happiness. 9 bean rows will I have, a hive for the honey bee. It is not enough that you eat, you have to drink. And the poet plans to drink honey, symbolizing the food of the gods, the nectar of the gods, and live alone in the bee-loved glade. Glade is a clearing in a forest. A clearing in a forest is open space in the woods. The poet has sited his cabin in a clearing in the woods, and he is planning to live there all alone. And the sound that he can hear, the only sound that he can hear perhaps, is the buzzing of the bees. Bee loud glade. The silence of the glade being disturbed by the bees. There is the unsaid contrast between the bee loud glade, the silent glade whose silence is broken by the sounds of nature, and perhaps the traffic of London. You must remember that this poem came to Yeats. He was a highly inspired poet, and this is a highly inspired poem that came to him when he was walking down Fleet Street in London. London with all its traffic and turmoil and confusion and sophistication and everything that Innisfree is not. When W.B. Yeats wrote the Lake Isle of Innisfree, he, I think, was suffering from a kind of depressional psychosis. He was having very severe financial problems. He was very unhappy in London, and it seemed to him that nothing was more important to him than escaping from the city. I think a comparison can be set up between the mood in which W.B.Yeats wrote The Lake Isle of Innisfree and the mood in which John Keats wrote Ode to a Nightingale. If I remember correctly, this is how Ode to a Nightingale begins. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk. Unquote. Incidentally, both Ode to a Nightingale and the Lake Isle of Innisfree were written in London. The first stanza embodies the decision of the poet, his determination to return to his native land, his ardent desire to go to the Irish countryside, to live in an uninhabited island in a remote part of Emerald Isle. When the second stanza opens, the poet reveals the rationale behind this decision. And I shall have some peace there. And I shall have some peace there. So that is why the poet decides to leave London and go to rural Ireland. And I shall have some peace there. The whole exercise is an attempt to attain peace, to achieve peace. Peace is a small word, but it's a very important word. Perhaps it's the most important word in the entire vocabulary. Peace means lack of disturbance. Peace means not being troubled by care, not being troubled by stress, not being troubled by worry. And I shall have some peace there. If you're at peace with yourself and your world, you don't need anything else. On the other hand, if you're not at peace with yourself and your world, nothing can help you. Nothing will be of use to you. And I shall have some peace there. And I think that all religions, all spiritual practices are an attempt to attain this peace. And you must remember that peace, it sounds simple, sounds easy, sounds common, is always elusive. You can gain everything else, but you cannot gain an inner peace, a spiritual peace. And then everything you have gained is of no use. I think in the Bible, Jesus asks, what doth it profit a man? What doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his own soul? Mark 8:36. So that is it. The most important thing in life is inner peace, is spiritual peace. And that precisely is what the poet seems to be lacking. And in pursuit of that peace, the poet moves or decides to move from London to Innisfree. The poet now explains how this peace is attained. This peace does not drop all of a sudden from somewhere or from nowhere. Peace comes slowly, gradually, from the veils of the morning to the song of the cricket. The cricket is an insect related to the grasshopper. It sings at night. So the peace that the poet seeks, the peace that the poet will attain will come gradually, slowly, from morning to night. In Innisfree, midnight's a glimmer, noon a purple glow, and evening is full of linnets' wings. Glimmer means to shine unsteadily with a wavering light. Glow means to shine steadily. And linnet, of course, is one of the classic birds of the Irish countryside. It's a songbird, it's a grey and brown bird, but its breast, its forehead is crimson, its breast is crimson. And during the mating season, it becomes one of the most beautiful of birds. What does the linnet signify? The linnet, according to me, symbolizes a last way of life. You must remember that the Irish countryside was full of linnets in the 18th century. But after that, their numbers started falling dramatically for a number of reasons. I'm not getting into that. And linnets are not seen as frequently in the Irish countryside as they used to be. And so the linnet symbolizes a lost way of life. There cannot be a bird which can be more identified with, with the Irish countryside than the linnet. If you are asked to name one bird which can symbolize, which can represent the countryside of Ireland, it is certainly the linnet. What is the poet trying to convey? He will attain peace by living a life in harmony with nature, by living a life in close communion with nature. Let me quote from the Tinton Abbey lines of William Wordsworth. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Unquote. In the central stanza of the poem, the poet explains why he wants to go to Innisfree. He wants to have some peace. He also explains how he will attain this goal by living in harmony with nature. In the last stanza, the poet repeats his resolve, reiterates his resolve to go to Innisfree and attempts to answer the question why he wants to go to Innisfree from a different perspective. As I said, the poet repeats his resolve, reiterates his determination to go to Innisfree and to go immediately to Innisfree. He will go now. The reason that is given for this decision in the last stanza is quite different from the reason given in the penultimate stanza. The poet says that night and day he can hear the lapping of lake water against the shore. To lap means to beat repeatedly, gently producing a soft sound, always, night and day, the poet can hear the lake water lapping against the shore, obviously the shore of Innisfree. Innisfree has become a sort of obsession with him, and he can hear the sound of the water lapping against the shore of the island, night and day. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavements grey, you must remember that the poet is in London, and wherever he be in the city of London, whether he is standing on the roadway or whether he is standing on a pavement, he can hear the sound of lake water lapping gently against the shore of the island of Innisfree. I think there is a subtle contrast between the city of London with its grey pavements and the colourful island of Innisfree. In Innisfree, midnight is a glimmer, noon is a purple glow, and the contrast is between the grey pavements of London and the glimmering midnight and the glowing noon of Innisfree. The message is clear. By the side of Innisfree, London is grey, London is dull, London is unbearably colourless and dull. Look at the beautiful last line of the poem. I hear it in the deep heart's core. After establishing a subtle contrast between monochromatic London with its grey pavements and colourful Innisfree and beautiful Innisfree, the poet reveals why and how he happens to hear the sound of water lapping softly by the shore, lake water lapping softly by the shore of the island of Innisfree. He hears it all the time, wherever he be in the city of London, whether he be standing on a roadway or on a pavement, because he hears it in his own heart. He hears it in the deep core of his own heart. The closure of the poem reveals how deeply, how passionately, how obsessively the poet loves his native land, Ireland, especially Sligo, from where his family came. I've already observed that this poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, is featured on the passports of Ireland. It's a rare honor. It's a unique honor. But the poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, and the poet W.B.Yeats certainly deserve that honor. I would like to bring into conjunction with the poem under discussion in general and with the closure of the poem in particular a few lines from the second stanza of W.B. Yeats's poem Towards break of day, I quote, I thought there is a waterfall upon Ben Bulben's side that all my childhood counted dear, were I to travel far and wide, I could not find a thing so dear. Unquote. Let us take a look at the Lake Isle of Innisfree as a nature poem. We frequently say that William Wordsworth is a nature poet. Why don't we say that William Butler Yeats is a nature poet? The Lake Isle of Innisfree is a spectacular nature poem. You must remember that, unlike many of the famous nature poems in the English language, it is rooted in a very specific reality. In Innisfree, in the middle of Loch Gill or Lough Gill in Sligo, in County Sligo, that gives the poem a powerful concreteness. We get vivid pictures of nature in the poem, beautiful descriptions that would challenge, would operate as a challenge to Wordsworth, widely looked upon as the greatest nature poet of the English language. We get graphic descriptions of nature, of the bees buzzing in the clearing, the bee loud glade, of the glimmering midnight, of the purple noon, of the linnets flying about in the evening, of the cricket singing, of the water of the lake lapping gently against the shore of the island. If this is not great nature poetry, what is? We say that Wordsworth is a great nature poet not merely because of his love for nature, not merely because of his passion for nature, not merely because of the descriptions that we find in his poetry, the descriptions of nature that we find in his poetry, but because he had a very profound philosophy with regard to nature. I think something similar can be said about Yeats in this specific context. The Lake Isle of Innisfree is a great nature poem. It contains spectacular, remarkable descriptions of nature. It showcases the poet's passionate love for nature. It is certainly a poem written not in ink, but in the heart's blood, in the heart's blood of the poet. But above all, the poem reveals the poet's profound philosophy with regard to nature. And the philosophy is that if we want peace, we have to go to nature, or rather return to nature. The only way to attain peace, so the poem proclaims, is to live in harmony with nature, is to become part of nature, is to live in complete communion with nature. And the poet makes it clear in the central stanza of the poem that he shall have some peace on moving to Innisfree and explains that this peace does not come all of a sudden. It comes gradually. It comes slowly. It is spread throughout the day and perhaps also throughout the night. And this peace, this profound spiritual peace, is attained by living in absolute harmony with nature. Once I happened to see a question in a question paper on the Lake Isle of Innisfree of W.B.Yeats, and the question was, what is the theme of the Lake Isle of Innisfree? What is the theme of the Lake Isle of Innisfree? The candidates were asked to write a short note on the theme of the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I would say that the poem does not have just one theme. It may be a short poem. It may consist of just 3 stanzas, but it does not have just one theme. It has a number of themes. First of all, you have the poet's love for his native land, the poet's love for Ireland, the poet's passion for the Irish countryside, the contrast between the city and the country. I think it was William Cooper who said, God made the country and man made the town. God made the country and man made the town. This becomes very clear to the reader by the time the poem under discussion comes to an end. The ugliness of the city, the dullness of the city, the greyness of the city, contrasted against the beauty of the countryside, contrasted against the color of the countryside. Specifically, the poem has as one of its themes the island of Innisfree. Innisfree is an uninhabited island in the middle of a lake, of a freshwater lake, Loch Gill or Lough Gill in Sligo, mostly in Sligo. One of the important themes of the poem is the desire for peace, the need for inner peace. How everything is meaningless if you are not able to attain peace, if you are not at peace with yourself and your world. And embedded in the poem is the philosophy that the way to attain peace is to live in harmony with nature. Of course, nature is a very important theme of the theme of the poem, especially the spectacular nature of the Irish countryside. You must remember that Ireland is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. It's called Emerald Isle because of the intense green that you meet with in the Irish countryside. And the poem celebrates the beauty of the Irish countryside with its glimmering midnights, its glowing noons, its bird life, its flora, its fauna, its bird life. The linnet, for example, which in the mating season has a crimson forehead and a crimson chest. The sound of the cricket, the soft sound of the lake water lapping against the shore of the island. I don't think many poems in Irish literature celebrate the beauty of nature as intensely, as passionately, as perfectly as the Lake Isle of Innisfree. Let us take a close look at the stylistic component of the poem. To begin with, the Lake Isle of Innisfree was a much longer poem, and W.B. Yeats spent long weeks polishing it up. In fact, to begin with, the poem had rambling lines and a rather loose syntax. But after weeks of labor, the poem became what it is now, a masterpiece from the stylistic point of view, with a very tight syntax. The poem has a very appropriate title. As we have already seen, the title is able to root the poem in the specific, concrete reality of rural Ireland, of Sligo to be more exact. This is a nature poem, not about nature in general, but about a specific spot, a very enchanting spot, a very idyllic spot in rural Ireland, in Sligo. Innisfree is an uninhabited island in the middle of a freshwater lake called Lough Gill. And Lough Gill is mostly in Sligo. The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I sometimes wonder whether there is more to it than meets the eye. Because after reading the poem, you realize that the speaker is something of an island himself. Just as Innisfree is an uninhabited island in the middle of a lake, the speaker is an island in the middle of the busy city, or the bustling city of London. The poem is organized in 3 stanzas. Each stanza comprises 4 lines. Thus, there are 12 lines in the poem. All the lines are not of even length. The poet deliberately places rather long lines side by side with rather short ones. And it can be said that the movement of the poem, generated by this alternating between long lines and short lines, the movement of the poem mimics the movement of the water of the lake lapping gently against the shore of the isle called Innisfree. The rhyme scheme is A-B, A-B, and it is consistently followed throughout the poem. The imagery is striking and often idyllic. We have images from natural life, images from country life, images from the insect world, avian imagery, and finally, images from urban life. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds, and alliteration is the repetition of consonantal sounds. The poet makes frequent use of both assonance and alliteration in the poem, as in the beloved glade, or perhaps live alone in the bee-loved glade. Purple glow, lake water lapping with low sounds. Anaphora is the repetition of words and phrases. The poet makes use of anaphora throughout the poem, beginning with the very first line, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. Caesura is a pause near the middle of a line. The poet uses it repeatedly in line after line in the poem in order to slow down the movement of the poem and to give the poem a dreamlike air. W.B. Yeats is, of course, a great symbolist, and we have to look for symbols in his poetry. As has already been observed, the linnet stands for a lost way of life. The linnet, the classic bird of the Irish countryside, which is no longer as common as it was, say, a couple of 100 years back, represents a lost way of life. And the poet's nostalgia for that lost way of life. The island of Innisfree, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. I'm not speaking of the title of the poem, but the island itself, standing in the middle of Lough Gill, can be said to symbolize the poet himself, the speaker himself, completely isolated in the city of London, totally out of place in the bustling city of London. The bean rose and the beehive, symbolize a simple lifestyle, an uncomplicated lifestyle, a rustic lifestyle, a lifestyle close to nature. The number 9 in 9 bean rows symbolizes, in line with Hindu religious thought, completeness, dignity, divine blessing, good fortune, spiritual peace. Metrical analysis of the poem is not easy, as the poem makes use of a rather complex system. The longer lines are usually hexameter, comprising 6 feet, and the shorter lines are usually tetrameter, consisting of 4 feet. The poet utilizes a variety of metrical feet, including the iamb, the trochee, and the anapaest. W.B. Yeats wrote a novel titled John Sherman. This is not known to most students. In 1891, W.B. Yeats wrote a novel titled John Sherman. I would like to sign off by observing that the poem under discussion can be related to the daydreams of the protagonist of that novel.